The National Famine Museum at Strokestown Park and Irish Heritage Trust are screening this film as part of the Great Famine Voices Roadshow 2020 online event series. The Great Famine Voices Roadshow is funded by the Government of Ireland Emigrant Support Programme.
So my grandparents are David Cooper and Catherine Cooper, and she was née Maloney. They're my paternal grandparents. My maternal grandparents were James Sheridan and Mary Jane McArdle. Catherine Maloney, she was born in a townland called Masbrook, not far from Castlebar, in 1864. She emigrated at some point. She was a teenager when she left Ireland. I think the purpose for her emigrating was to follow her elder sister, Barbara, who had found work in service in Merseyside. But she managed to get work to start with in Glasgow, again in service. So she went to Glasgow, that was her route from Ireland. Whether she liked it or whether it worked out, I don't know. But she didn't stay in Glasgow. She then came down to Liverpool, which is where she settled for the rest of her life. She married my grandfather, David Cooper. David was born in Liverpool and his father was from Liverpool, William Cooper. But sadly what happened to him was that he as a very young boy, he was orphaned. He was born in 1865 and his father died in 1866. I know there was a typhus and a cholera outbreak in Liverpool at that point, so we don't know. We haven't got it for certain, but it raises the possibility that he lost him due to that, because we also know that they were living in the poorest areas and the poorest immigrant areas in the city where the outbreaks were at their greatest. 3 years later, in 69, so he'd be just 3, he lost his mother as well. And we know there was a scarlet fever outbreak in Liverpool in that year. So we suspect that they were victims of these public health problems, which ran with the circumstances that they were living in. So what happened then was that he was, I think, informally adopted by his aunt and his uncle, whose name was McCoy. Now they'd come over from Ireland, and they were Roseanne McCoy. James McCoy was Roseanne McCoy's brother, and so they took him in as well as his 2 sisters, and they were recorded in an 1871 census as living in Cumberland Street as, in inverted commas, lodgers in a courthouse. Some years later, in the next census, I think David was 6 in 1871. He was 16 at the next census. He was recorded as living in Norman Street, in another courthouse, but this time just with his adoptive mother. So presumably his sisters had moved on. And there's no mention of her husband, so we don't know what happened to him in the intervening period. They married in 1895 in St. Francis Xavier's Church, and I think they were living in the area near St. Francis Xavier's. They went on to, lead their lives in Liverpool. When Catherine first arrived in Liverpool, she obviously her aim was to get work, and in common with a lot of young women of that period, she managed to get work in service, and that was in Croxteth, a hall with the Molyneux, and it's perhaps an indicator of the the atmosphere of the time, that she felt very uneasy going to Mass on a Sunday morning. She felt that would have been regarded with suspicion. So, according to family history, she was sort of secreting herself out on Sunday mornings to head to Mass. She was spotted doing this by the Molyneux, but in fairness to them, they asked her why she was going out of the estate and where she was going, and she told them. And in fairness to them, they said, "Oh, well, you should have time out of work to be able to attend your religious worship." But whether she liked service, I'm not that entirely sure, because her next stab at employment was in the city centre, where she was trying to get work in the city centre shops. And again, she seems to have been not sort of, as a migrant perhaps this would be the case, not brilliantly aware of the lay of the land in terms of sectarian employment at the time. Because she went for interviews, or it would have been sort of, rough and ready interviews in a number of shops. And of course, in those days, they'd ask what your religion was. So she just said she was a Catholic. And on hearing that, the interview didn't go any further. And then she got to an interview with a shop which survived until, I think, into the 70s in Liverpool city centre, a woman's clothing shop called C&A Modes. Now, they had a history of employing Catholics. I know that because my sister Maureen worked for them, and all the women who worked for them were Catholics, and Maureen knew that was their tradition. Catherine didn't know that, unfortunately, and by that time she thought she'd need to play cute. So when she was asked what religion she had, she said that she was Protestant. So that meant that that was the end of that job prospect. So it just gives a feel of what it was like in terms of sectarianism. And of course, the other feel that you get from their early lives is just the abysmal quality of accommodation and housing that people were living in. It's interesting that David Cooper and his relatives are living in courthouses all around the sort of the edges, the northern edges of the city centre. David and Catherine didn't stay there. They moved to a number of places, but Wavertree was the sort of base that they ended up in. When my dad was born in 1908, they recorded as living in a street called Ashworth Street in Wavertree. One of the questions that you've asked me is what were the sorts of challenges that they faced. I think obviously the poverty, sectarianism, and the degree of exclusion that went with that was something that they experienced. In addition to that, or probably related to that, was an incredible experience of bereavement that they encountered, because Catherine and David, they had six children in all. Two of them survived to live in Liverpool and grow up and spend their lives here. That was my dad and his sister, who was older than him by a couple of years. None of the others, three died very early in their lives, and there's a story related to one of the others. One of them, Catherine, she died when she fell into a bonfire. At one point they lived out at Ford, out in Litherland, and the death inquest just records her as having died at Stanley Hospital from lockjaw set up by accidental burns. A brother, he died of, again, lockjaw or blood poisoning set up by accidental injury. And a third brother, he died when an advertising hoarding in a road called Botanic Road was blown down in a gale, and he was crushed by that as a boy. So that just left three of them, the eldest of whom was David. David became a ship's electrician. He took a ship for North America, possibly Canada, and he was just never heard from again. And his mother struggled to understand that as to, you know, how that could have happened for somebody who'd experienced such bereavement already. On the other side of the family, Martin, he got married. He married Kathleen Sheridan. Now, the Sheridans had been around Liverpool for a bit longer than the Maloneys and the McCoys stroke Coopers. It was my great-grandfather that came over from Ireland, a guy called Patrick Sheridan. And he was recorded as having been living in court accommodation, this time in Hunter Street, shortly before James Sheridan, my grandfather, was born. And I think he was born in 1881, 1883. The census was 81. He was at that point employed as a coal heaver, so the census says. And the next thing that we hear about them is that they're over on the south side of the city, living around, what would have been called in the old days Toxteth Park, Beaufort Street. His wife, my great-grandmother, a woman called Mary Ann Riley, was living in Hislop Street, all around the South Docks. My grandfather, James, he followed his dad. His dad got him work in the docks. And he had actually quite a decent route out of circumstances of poverty through expertise and acumen that he developed on the docks. He at some point became a gang leader, and in his later life was a stevedores foreman. So much so that he had a family of 9 children, one of whom was my mum, and he could afford to pay for the older children to be educated. But during, again, the troubles of that period, he was apparently extremely active in the docks. He was active in the Irish Nationalist Party, and then subsequently in the Labour Party as this sort of Catholic element to that. And he was also active in a very direct way with the dockers, because he hadn't been formally educated beyond 14, but he could read, and he could read and write, which was a real asset on the docks. And one of the things that he did, and was, you know, sort of encouraged to do, was to spend any time he could reading reports in the newspapers, whether they were Irish or British, I don't know, of what was happening in Ireland during both the uprising and the War of Independence. And the other thing he was involved in was doing what he could to help fellow dockers from Ireland to learn how to read. But he managed to sort of progress reasonably well and get out of the pretty awful situation that they were all in. There are now surviving for us, where there was 5 of us, there are 4 of us surviving, and that aspect of the Irish aspect of our identity has always been a dimension for us. I mean, we grew up very much as Liverpudlians, and very much related to things that were happening in the city when we were growing up in it. I mean, I was growing up in the 60s and just took a great pride in the Beatles, and I'm an Evertonian and the successes of Everton in those days. So we were very much part of the city. But on top of that was this other layer in our identity, and that was always around. And we learned things because the family was great for storytelling. I mean, we getting together with aunties and uncles and hearing stories of the past, or even Sunday afternoon at home, just hearing stories and hearing the stories repeated was part of our experience. So that sort of became part of us. And I guess as well, the Irish dimension of our experience, or our identity rather, was framed by the community that we as the Coopers grew up in. We grew up in the south of the city, in Garston, and the Catholic Church, St Francis of Assisi, was very much the hub of the community. So what we found was that it was a Liverpool Irish community. So we had friends whose parents came from similar backgrounds, whose grandparents came from similar backgrounds, and you could almost exist in a world that you thought, well, what other way is there to exist? That was our world for some time, even though we were living within what is really a multicultural and multicultural city. So that was part of it, and as a result, it's just stayed. But my father, he visited Ireland with his mum. He told one of my brothers how he used to go as a boy on the ship, and then on train to Castlebar, and then pony and trap to the family home, the Maloney family home in Mayo. And it's something that we've done. All of us, have visited and still visit Ireland. And and we've all taken a history in Irish literature and Irish culture and Irish history. So, and with the internet these days, that's a much easier thing to do.